When Senator John Kennedy's single, devastating question about stolen taxpayer money abruptly left Congresswoman Ilhan Omar utterly speechless, it completely shattered the standard illusion of Washington politics. Hundreds of congressional hearings unfold in the nation's capital every single year, functioning as nothing more than rehearsed, painfully predictable political theater where exhausted staffers silently pass handwritten notes and complacent senators mindlessly recite pre-written questions into an empty void. It is the steady, unremarkable background noise of a sprawling bureaucracy built entirely on partisan maneuvering and calculated avoidance. But the unprecedented confrontation between Senator Kennedy and Congresswoman Omar was an entirely different spectacle altogether, a masterclass in prosecutorial dismantling that brutally stripped away the usual polished veneer of congressional oversight. The chaotic prelude to this specific moment was entirely defined by a deafening, systematic series of evasions. When a legitimate state fraud committee back in Minnesota formally invited Congresswoman Omar to willingly testify regarding a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar federal nutrition scandal ravaging the heart of her own district, she flatly and unapologetically refused. When frustrated state investigators established a firm, legally binding deadline for the essential production of crucial documents, she willfully missed it without offering a single second of hesitation. When authorities inevitably moved to issue a formal legal subpoena to compel her cooperation, her fierce political allies on the investigative committee swiftly intervened, aggressively blocking the vote and effectively shielding her from mandatory sworn testimony. The blatant avoidance actively continued in the highly publicized, marble-lined corridors of the Capitol building itself, where a determined Fox News reporter successfully intercepted her with a completely straightforward, highly relevant question about her basic willingness to cooperate with the massive, ongoing criminal investigation. She simply turned her shoulder, locked her eyes straight ahead, and walked directly past the rolling camera, her chilling silence hanging heavily in the tense hallway. 3 separate, formal invitations for basic transparency had resulted in 3 profound, calculated silences, ultimately setting the perfect stage for Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana to send a formal congressional letter that would forcibly drag her into the exact blinding spotlight she had been trying so desperately to escape. She absolutely should have simply ignored that letter and made it 4 consecutive silences. But instead, she disastrously chose to engage in a high-stakes battle she was profoundly unprepared to fight. Congresswoman Omar did not wait for Senator Kennedy to formally pose his initial question, nor did she patiently wait for the sharp, authoritative strike of the chairman's gavel to officially command the turbulent room. Before the veteran senator from Louisiana could even manage to finish the opening sentence of his procedural inquiry, she aggressively cut him off, instantly launching into a meticulously rehearsed, highly defensive monologue, explicitly designed to seize immediate control of the media narrative. She fiercely declared, with an air of absolute, manufactured outrage, that the entire federal investigation was nothing more than a vicious, politically motivated witch hunt explicitly and unfairly targeting the vulnerable Somali community. She forcefully framed the legitimate financial inquiry as a direct, unprovoked assault on hard-working immigrant families who had desperately sought refuge in America for a chance at a better life, boldly proclaiming for the permanent congressional record that she would absolutely not sit there while conservative members of the legislative body callously used starving children as a convenient political prop for their underlying deep-seated Islamophobic agenda. It was a staggering, deeply inflammatory accusation hurled directly across the polished mahogany table, a desperate, calculated attempt to fundamentally weaponize identity politics as a definitive shield against necessary financial oversight. Think deeply about the sheer, unadulterated audacity of that specific moment in time. American taxpayers, stretching across the entire nation, simply wanted to logically know exactly where their hard-earned money had mysteriously vanished. The voting public wanted to fundamentally understand how a massive, well-intentioned federal relief program, explicitly designed and heavily funded to feed desperate, vulnerable children during the peak of a devastating global pandemic, had seamlessly and rapidly morphed into a sprawling, highly coordinated criminal enterprise. Yet, in direct response to that basic, undeniable demand for fundamental fiscal accountability, she looked directly into the unflinching lens of a broadcast camera, sitting comfortably in a historic building funded entirely by taxpayer dollars, and boldly stated that merely asking basic logistical questions about stolen public funds inherently makes the questioner a vicious bigot. Senator Kennedy physically absorbed the full, heavy weight of her fiery, desperate accusation, without so much as a single visible flinch, silently cataloging and remembering every single defensive syllable of her aggressive deflection. He decisively chose not to immediately respond with matching, theatrical outrage. Instead, he simply looked down at his desk, calmly picked up his silver pen, and methodically wrote something short and deliberate in the narrow, lined margin of his yellow legal pad. The right corner of his mouth moved just slightly upward, subtly forming an expression that was not quite a genuine smile, but something much closer to quiet, undeniable recognition. It was the distinct, terrifying look of a seasoned, battle-tested litigator who has just calmly watched a highly hostile witness enthusiastically confirm exactly the flawed behavioral pattern he had painstakingly anticipated from the very beginning. Here is the fundamental, unvarnished truth about exactly how John Kennedy strategically operates within the high-stakes, deeply intense arena of a packed congressional committee room. When he suddenly goes completely quiet, he is absolutely not losing the heated argument, nor is he remotely confused or intimidated by the aggressive onslaught of partisan attack. He is meticulously, silently counting. He is coldly calculating exactly how many rhetorical and legal doors the panicked witness has just violently slammed shut on their own defense, and he is carefully mapping out exactly how few logical exits remain available for their inevitable, crushing retreat. And when that calculated number of escape routes drops perilously close to zero, that is exactly when his slow, unmistakable, deeply resonant Louisiana drawl officially breaks the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Congresswoman, I deeply appreciate you being here with us today. I just have a few very simple questions for you, and then you can easily get right back to your busy day. That specific, seemingly innocuous word simple was chosen with absolute, lethal precision. Anyone who has ever watched this brilliant man systematically dismantle a highly credentialed, aggressively prepped judicial nominee, or witnessed him expertly unspool a powerful, arrogant cabinet secretary using absolutely nothing but a polite, folksy demeanor and a question a fifth grader could easily comprehend, inherently understands the devastating, crushing weight of that specific word. When John Kennedy politely promises a simple question, it universally guarantees that the unfortunate person sitting directly across from him is about to experience the absolute worst, most agonizing, severely career-damaging afternoon of their entire professional life. Kennedy calmly began his methodical, terrifying deconstruction by clearly establishing the foundational, undeniable legislative architecture of the massive fraud scandal. You personally authored a specific provision known as the Meals Act. Is that factually correct? Congresswoman Omar quickly and confidently confirmed her direct legislative role, openly acknowledging her sole authorship of the bill. And that specific provision, for the very first time in the lengthy, highly regulated history of the federal child nutrition program, explicitly allowed private, for-profit restaurants to aggressively participate in the massive distribution of federal funds. Is that correct? She immediately attempted to distribute the looming political weight of the controversial legislation, swiftly pointing out that it had proudly passed with broad, sweeping bipartisan support and was ultimately formally signed into binding law by former President Donald Trump himself. I understand that completely, Kennedy smoothly and dismissively replied, utterly refusing to be derailed by the desperate partisan deflection. And that very same legislative provision also explicitly permitted what they legally call grab-and-go meal distribution, fundamentally meaning that federal meals could be readily picked up in massive bulk quantities without any formal, in-person verification whatsoever that the vulnerable children supposedly being served actually existed in reality. Is that also factually correct? For the very first time that afternoon, Omar visibly hesitated, a fleeting, terrifying half-second of stark realization flashing violently across her face before she quietly, reluctantly confirmed the damning procedural fact. The entire trajectory of the explosive hearing shifted irrevocably and permanently in that brief span of 60 intense seconds. Kennedy had masterfully deployed 3 straightforward, binary yes or no questions without raising his voice a single decibel, without engaging in any theatrical, table-pounding grandstanding, and without leveling a single direct, actionable accusation. Yet, in doing so, he had successfully and permanently forced her to establish 3 devastating, legally binding facts. firmly under the severe penalty of federal perjury. She personally wrote the specific law in question. Her specific legislation actively and intentionally removed the critical anti-fraud safeguards, and consequently, millions of federal taxpayer-funded meals could be systematically distributed to phantom, non-existent children who may have never actually drawn a breath. No seasoned politician has ever been instantly, fatally destroyed by a single yes or no question, but the undeniable reality in that room was that she was already bleeding out politically, and she did not even possess the situational awareness to realize the severe depth of the wound just yet. This is precisely the strategic, deeply calculated brilliance that most casual observers and even seasoned political operatives utterly fail to comprehend about Senator Kennedy's relentless investigative methodology. He absolutely never initiates the fierce confrontation by dropping a massive, highly visible rhetorical bomb. He never leads his methodical interrogation with a glaring, aggressive accusation that a defensive witness can easily bat away with manufactured partisan outrage or rehearsed talking points. Instead, he meticulously, quietly lays down an unshakable foundation of verifiable, documented facts that the trapped witness has absolutely no choice but to confirm on the record, knowing perfectly well that explicitly denying them would constitute a provable, devastating lie that could trigger an immediate perjury referral. Every single time the trapped witness reluctantly answers yes, they are unwittingly handing him yet another heavy, undeniable brick. And by the time the highly defensive, panicked witness finally looks around and fully realizes they are standing precariously on top of a massive, inescapable wall that Kennedy has slowly, quietly built entirely around them, it is entirely too late to safely climb down without completely breaking their own political legs. Dozens of highly trained, extremely well-prepared witnesses have fallen directly into this exact, devastating trap over the lengthy course of his Senate career. The particularly sharp, highly intuitive ones rapidly recognize the perilous, escalating pattern by the third, seemingly innocent question and immediately start aggressively, desperately hedging their anxious answers. The arrogant ones who tragically fail to recognize the immense danger just keep blindly nodding and confidently saying yes until the solid, protective floor beneath them completely, violently disappears. Having firmly established the precise legislative framework of the massive fraud, Kennedy smoothly reached his hand into a plain manila folder resting quietly on his desk and slowly, deliberately pulled out a single, unadorned sheet of standard white paper. Just one single page. He placed it perfectly flat on the polished mahogany committee table directly between them and smoothed it out exactly once with the heavy palm of his right hand. "Congresswoman, do you happen to recognize this specific printed document?" She forcefully squinted, leaning slightly forward in her heavy chair before stating defensively, with a hint of manufactured annoyance, that she could not clearly read it from her distant, elevated vantage point. Kennedy, perfectly anticipating the completely standard evasion, immediately provided the damning, specific context without missing a single beat. "It is a direct, verified printout of the official menu from a specific restaurant located right in the heart of Minneapolis called the Safari Restaurant. Are you intimately, personally familiar with that particular commercial establishment?" Omar, instantly recognizing the specific name and deeply sensing the rapidly encroaching danger, offered a broad, highly evasive generalization. "I am intimately familiar with many diverse, wonderful restaurants located throughout my expansive congressional district." Senator Kennedy remained entirely, visibly unbothered by her desperate, sweeping deflection, perfectly allowing the palpable, suffocating tension to thicken the recycled air of the completely silent committee room. "I am absolutely, completely sure you are. However, this particular, specific restaurant managed to successfully, miraculously bill the federal government of the United States for a staggering, incomprehensible $12 million, strictly through a localized distribution program called Feeding Our Future. Let me repeat that exact figure so we are clear. $12 million strictly earmarked for vulnerable children's meals, funneled entirely and completely through a single, standalone restaurant operation. He deliberately, masterfully let that colossal, reality-bending number sit incredibly heavy in the quiet room, allowing every single note-taking staffer, every cynical journalist, and every elected official present to internally process the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the massive financial claim. And Congresswoman, you purposefully, intentionally, held your highly publicized 2018 election night victory celebration directly at this exact, specific restaurant. Is that also factually, undeniably correct? Omar visibly, uncomfortably shifted her weight in her heavy leather chair, her previously relaxed posture suddenly becoming intensely rigid as the devastating implications of the direct connection became terrifyingly, abundantly clear. I have held numerous, highly attended campaign events at many diverse, widely scattered locations throughout my expansive district over the many years of my public service, she retorted sharply, aggressively attempting to fundamentally sever the deeply associative tie he was weaving. Simply holding a routine, standard campaign event at a local restaurant absolutely, categorically, does not imply any underlying, secret knowledge of that specific restaurant's potentially illicit or fraudulent business activities. Kennedy slowly, methodically tilted his head to the side, his sharp eyes locking directly onto hers with a piercing, deeply unsettling intensity. Does it not strike you as profoundly, deeply unusual, Congresswoman, that the single largest, most egregious, most financially devastating fraud site in this entire sprawling, historic federal criminal case just coincidentally happens to be the exact same restaurant where you proudly, publicly celebrated your hard-fought political election victory? Omar immediately, desperately fell back on the absolute most pathetic, transparent defense legally available to any cornered politician, claiming dismissively that random, unexplainable coincidences simply happen in the complex modern world. Kennedy's immediate response was a devastating, perfectly delivered masterstroke of rhetorical, prosecutorial pressure. They absolutely do. They certainly do happen every day. But in my extensive, decades-long legal experience, when those supposedly random coincidences start aggressively, repeatedly stacking up in the exact same localized zip code, completely within the exact same congressional district, consistently involving the exact same tight-knit group of associated people, they violently, abruptly stop being coincidences and they decisively, legally, start becoming evidence. She did not utter a single, solitary word in response to that devastating, pinpoint characterization. She just swallowed hard and let it completely pass by, unchallenged. That heavy silence was her second catastrophic, irreversible mistake of the long afternoon. Her very first, ultimately, was simply deciding to show up to the fight. Kennedy nodded thoughtfully, entirely unhurried, purposefully making another slow, deliberate note on his glowing yellow legal pad. He expertly, mercilessly let her glaring non-answer linger heavily in the tense, overheated room, the precise, exact way one lets a dark, ugly stain permanently set into a pristine, expensive white tablecloth. Every single person present could clearly see the immense damage. Absolutely nobody needed to explicitly, loudly point it out to the crowd. Then, his tone shifted entirely, completely abandoning the prosecutor's edge and becoming incredibly quiet, almost startlingly, unnervingly gentle. It was that uniquely ominous, terrifying cadence a seasoned man from Louisiana naturally adopts right before he is about to quietly deliver a devastating truth that is going to profoundly, permanently hurt. $12 million, Congresswoman. Do you possess any genuine human understanding of exactly what that immense, staggering sum of taxpayer money actually buys in the real world? That is fully funded, highly nutritious school lunches for every single, solitary child currently residing in your entire congressional district for 2 full, consecutive years. That equates directly to every single one of those kids receiving a hot, healthy meal, every single day. For every kid who tragically, quietly shows up to a public school profoundly hungry on the freezing, unforgiving streets of Minneapolis. And instead of feeding them, somebody working directly at that specific, celebrated restaurant actively bought a luxury, high-end Maserati with that exact money. Somebody else actively, greedily bought prime, expensive real estate property. Somebody else systematically, illegally wired massive, untraceable sums of money to shadowy overseas accounts. And the deeply vulnerable, innocent children that your specific, highly touted law was explicitly written to fiercely protect went agonizingly, painfully hungry. All while these supposedly upstanding, trusted adults casually, ruthlessly cashed massive federal checks with their own personal names brazenly, arrogantly printed right on the official invoices. He slowly, respectfully set the menu printout down gently on the solid table and purposefully, deliberately did not touch it again. It remained securely there for the absolute entirety of the long hearing, a single, damning page lying completely face up, serving as a silent, inescapable monument to the massive, unforgivable theft. Kennedy then decisively, firmly picked up a significantly thicker, much more physically imposing document, holding it up high so that both a defensive Omar and her deeply anxious legal counsel could clearly, undeniably observe the official, stamped cover page. I currently hold directly in my hands highly authenticated, verified copies of official trial exhibits, sourced directly from the successful, sweeping federal prosecution of Amy Bach. Miss Bach was the primary founder and chief executive director of the organization known as Feeding Our Future. She was decisively, thoroughly convicted on multiple severe, overlapping federal counts and was formally, legally sentenced just 3 short weeks ago to 41 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Let that horrific number sink deep into your mind. 41 years. That unequivocally, undeniably represents the absolute largest, most heavily punished pandemic fraud sentence ever handed down in all of American history. He methodically, deliberately opened the thick, imposing binder, the crisp sound of the heavy turning pages echoing loudly and aggressively in the completely silent, hyper-focused room. Carefully, legally documented among these official, verified trial exhibits are direct, undeniable email exchanges occurring frequently between high-level, senior members of your official congressional staff and specific, named individuals who have since been federally, permanently convicted of massive, coordinated fraud in this exact, specific case. I would now like to formally, legally read some of them directly into the permanent congressional record. He absolutely did not rush the execution of this fatal blow. He meticulously, clearly read the specific, undeniable dates, leaving absolutely no room for chronological ambiguity or desperate spin. He read the actual, verified names, definitively and publicly linking real political operatives to real, convicted criminals. He read verbatim, highly specific subject lines that undeniably, fundamentally connected senior, trusted figures securely inside Omar's congressional office directly to corrupt individuals who are currently sitting in absolute disgrace behind thick steel bars in federal prison cells. He generously, almost cruelly gave Omar ample, agonizing time to adequately, publicly respond after every single, devastating entry was read. She frantically utilized that provided time to nervously, desperately whisper to her deeply anxious counsel, to furiously look down and violently shuffle her scattered, useless papers, to do absolutely anything and everything possible except directly, honestly address the devastating, undeniable evidence he had just formally entered into the permanent, unerasable congressional record. There is something fundamentally, psychologically terrifying about absolute silence in a high-stakes, heavily guarded congressional hearing room. Standard, everyday silence strictly following a complex, highly technical question is merely dead air. It happens continuously as exhausted witnesses gather their scattered thoughts or bored senators shuffle disorganized briefing papers. Nobody truly, deeply notices it. But absolute silence immediately following the devastating presentation of undeniable, concrete criminal evidence is a completely different, terrifying beast, entirely. That specific brand of heavy silence is the deafening, physical sound of a packed, breathing room full of highly intelligent people simultaneously, violently realizing that the powerful, arrogant person sitting directly in front of them absolutely does not possess a single viable, coherent answer, and every single, solitary soul in that room is acutely, painfully aware of that devastating, career-ending fact. Eventually, Omar desperately, frantically attempted to construct a weak procedural firewall to stop the bleeding. Senator, my incredibly busy office systematically, routinely processes tens of thousands of basic constituent communications every single month, routinely responding to a standard, everyday email originating from a local constituent is fundamentally, entirely standard congressional practice. It absolutely, categorically, is not definitive, legal evidence of active, knowing participation in any underlying, sweeping criminal activity. Kennedy instantly, effortlessly agreed with her, completely neutralizing her desperate procedural defense long before it could ever fully take root in the minds of the committee. I completely, fundamentally agree with you entirely on that specific procedural point, Congresswoman. A standard, routine email response is unequivocally, undeniably not a federal crime, but you and I both clearly know, and everyone in this room knows, these are absolutely not innocent emails from ordinary, concerned citizens earnestly asking about filling annoying, dangerous potholes on Lake Street. These are highly specific, deeply coordinated communications with individuals who were methodically, systematically, and ruthlessly stealing federal taxpayer money explicitly, legally meant for starving, desperate children. And furthermore, the very woman who meticulously, coldly ran the entire massive criminal operation, Amy Bach, explicitly and legally told federal investigators under oath, fully aware of the penalties of perjury, that you were, and I am quoting directly, word for word, from the official trial record here, likely aware of the massive billing irregularities deeply embedded in the program. Omar immediately fiercely lashed out at the highly damaged source of the brutal accusation, her voice instantly tightening with visible, undeniable panic and sheer desperation. Miss Bach is a highly motivated, completely disgraced convicted felon who is actively, desperately attempting to aggressively negotiate a heavily reduced prison sentence. Senator, her heavily compromised, entirely self-serving testimony carries absolutely zero legal credibility in this chamber or any other respectable room. Kennedy's response was incredibly swift, utterly devoid of emotion, and absolutely merciless. She ultimately received 41 grueling years behind federal bars. Ma'am, I sincerely, genuinely do not believe she is successfully negotiating much of anything at this particular, devastating point in her ruined life. You could palpably, physically feel the immediate, drastic shift in the massive room's highly charged atmosphere. It was absolutely not characterized by loud, partisan applause or theatrical, exaggerated gasps, but by something much quieter, much deeper, and far more profound. The distinct, perfectly synchronized sound of deeply engrossed, absolutely stunned people slowly leaning back in their heavy wooden chairs, the subtle, unmistakable sound of glowing cell phones being hastily and quietly put away into pockets. Whatever breaking political news was flashing brightly on those tiny screens was instantly, completely rendered utterly irrelevant compared to the raw, visceral political execution happening just 6 short feet directly in front of them. The highly paid staffers sitting tightly on Omar's side of the room had entirely, completely ceased taking any notes whatsoever. One was completely, visibly frozen in pure shock, intensely staring at the glowing red exit sign directly above the heavy wooden doors as if contemplating a physical escape. Recognizing the sheer, unadulterated desperation of her rapidly collapsing position, Omar suddenly, violently launched a highly rehearsed counterattack that was, objectively speaking, genuinely formidable. She abruptly sat up completely straight, locked her wide eyes directly and aggressively with Senator Kennedy, and fiercely, forcefully, delivered the absolute strongest, most coherent, deeply aggressive defensive moment of her entire brutal, disastrous afternoon, when Congresswoman Ilhan Omar forcefully launched her massive counterpunch against Senator John Kennedy. The tension in the hearing room instantly reached a boiling point. She fiercely reminded the veteran lawmaker, for the permanent record, that it was President Donald Trump who proudly signed the sweeping legislation containing her provision into binding federal law, his appointed USDA secretary who established the complex regulatory framework, and his hand-picked administration that actively oversaw its initial rollout, boldly daring Kennedy to direct his aggressive partisan scrutiny toward the former president instead. The desperate maneuver landed with undeniable weight, thrilling, anxious Democrats who vividly smelled blood in the turbulent water, because every single word she loudly stated was a concrete, verifiable historical fact. But Kennedy slowly, calmly took a deep, deliberate breath, utilizing 2 excruciating seconds of profound silence, not out of fearful hesitation, but to powerfully signify a deeply calculated, highly lethal decision. His rich Southern voice suddenly dropped half a register, slowing to a crawling, hyper-methodical pace as he masterfully conceded her point. Before relentlessly pressing his massive advantage, he accurately noted that while the president did sign the law, he absolutely did not hold his lavish election victory party at the Safari restaurant, unequivocally did not directly exchange highly suspicious emails with convicted felon Amy Bach, and categorically did not stubbornly refuse to testify before a legitimate state fraud committee. Moving with theatrical precision, Kennedy set his silver pen down exactly next to a printed menu from that very restaurant and meticulously laid out the devastating reality that an astonishing 65 individuals had been definitively convicted in federal court, with the massive scheme's mastermind currently serving 41 grueling years in prison. He methodically cornered her with the undeniable facts. Her specific legislative action created the massive structural opening for the historic fraud. Her taxpayer-funded office directly communicated with federal defendants now sitting in guarded prison cells, and every single time she was respectfully asked to transparently explain these highly questionable actions, she stubbornly refused to show up, aggressively blamed others, or cowardly walked away in terrified silence. Visibly panicking, Omar desperately pulled the heavy metal microphone toward her stressed face, her trembling voice meticulously controlled, as she forcefully argued that while 65 people were convicted, she had factually never been charged or named in any sweeping federal indictment, demanding he immediately stop implying criminal guilt by pure geographic association. Kennedy slowly, methodically nodded, completely absorbing her highly legalistic defense and genuinely agreeing that she had not been officially charged, before delivering a devastating, inescapable truth. Absolutely none of the greedy individuals intimately connected to that fraudulent restaurant who brazenly filed fake invoices and cashed massive stolen federal checks had been formally charged either, right up until the exact devastating moment they abruptly and permanently were. Omar frantically reached for the microphone a second humiliating time, her lips parting to launch a fiery rebuttal, but she simply froze. The exact same deeply aggressive politician who had once loudly screamed at a sitting president during a nationally televised State of the Union address now sat utterly paralyzed on a random Tuesday afternoon, completely unable to produce a single coherent word of defense before decisively pushing the microphone away in total defeat. Kennedy patiently waited, explicitly trusting the agonizing, unbroken silence to do the heaviest emotional work in the room, before summarizing the heartbreaking, entirely preventable tragedy with a quiet, measured cadence that would haunt her career permanently. He reminded the silent room that a staggering $250 million meant for profoundly hungry, deeply vulnerable American children was ruthlessly stolen, and after writing the exact law that made it possible and celebrating at the restaurant that cashed the checks, she cowardly ran when asked to explain. He then delivered 7 unforgettable, devastating words with the same slow Louisiana drawl he might use to say grace before a Sunday dinner. The children were hungry, you were not. Without a single furious partisan outburst or theatrical accusation, Omar abruptly stood up, gathered her scattered, completely useless papers against her chest like a weak physical shield, and walked silently toward the heavy wooden side exit with her counsel exactly 3 steps behind, leaving the exact, distinct way deeply guilty people leave when they fundamentally know the unforgiving cameras will endlessly replay their defeat for the rest of their ruined careers. The absolute magnitude of this profound moral failure transcends everyday politics, as highly vulnerable children in her own Minneapolis district continue to walk to school with painfully rumbling stomachs, while their life-saving federal funding paid for by exhausted working mothers, honorable veterans, and elderly retirees on strict fixed incomes was systematically plundered by soulless adults to buy luxury cars, overseas properties, and lavish lifestyles. After the tense hearing abruptly concluded, Kennedy silently walked out the side door without taking a single question from the desperate swarming press, intentionally leaving the damning printout of the Safari restaurant menu, sitting aggressively face up under the bright lights of the empty committee room. She undeniably wrote the sweeping law that kicked the heavy door wide open. She publicly celebrated at the exact place that boldly walked through it. And when the American people finally cornered her to demand an honest explanation, she desperately ran directly into the dark. So the chilling question that remains is exactly who else is currently hiding in that exact same terrifying darkness, furiously sweating and nervously waiting for the very next inevitable federal subpoena to finally devastatingly drop?